The architectural drawings had lied. That was Carolina Voss's first thought as she stepped out of the rental car and looked up at the Cannon Cove lighthouse for the first time in a decade. Not the sweeping, dramatic realization she had perhaps expected after 10 years of absence. Not some cinematic moment of reconciliation with her past. Just a cold, professional assessment. The drawings had lied. Or more precisely, whoever had submitted those structural reports to the County Heritage Board had either been criminally negligent or pathologically optimistic. The lantern room's glass was visibly fogged from the outside. Not condensation, but a deep systemic oxidation that suggested years of neglect. The external iron staircase spiraling up the lighthouse's southern face had separated from the wall at 2 points she could already identify from here, 30 feet away, standing in the gravel lot with her portfolio case cutting into her palm. The keeper's cottage attached at the base sagged on its northeast corner like a tired man leaning against a door frame. And the fog signal building, the small outbuilding that housed what remained of the original clockwork mechanism, had lost its roof entirely on the seaward side, replaced at some point by a blue tarpaulin that had long since given up the pretense of doing its job. 10 years. She had been gone exactly 10 years, 4 months, and somewhere in the neighborhood of 11 days. Though she was not counting. She had been very deliberate about not counting. Carolina set her portfolio case down in the gravel and pressed her fingers against the bridge of her nose. The cold hit her differently here than it did in Boston. Boston's cold was aggressive, urban, a cold that shoved you and kept moving. The cold rolling off the Oregon coast in mid-October was patient. It settled into the space between your collar and your jaw and waited. She pulled out her phone and opened the County Heritage Board's attached file for the 8th time since leaving PDX that morning, scrolling to the section titled Preliminary Structural Condition, Satisfactory, with Recommended Interventions. She stared at the word satisfactory for a long moment. Satisfactory, she said aloud. To no one. A gull screamed back at her from somewhere above the cliffs. Yeah, she agreed. That's what I thought. If you've ever loved something, or someone, you thought you'd left behind for good, this story might feel very familiar. Like and subscribe so you don't miss a single chapter. She had told herself, on the plane, and then again in the rental car navigating the coast highway with its spectacular and somewhat terrifying drop to the left, that she was coming back to Cannon Cove for professional reasons. This was important. She had rehearsed this framing carefully, the way you rehearse a presentation for a difficult client. With attention to word choice, with preemptive answers to anticipated objections, with a kind of practiced conviction that, if performed consistently, eventually starts to feel like actual conviction. The Voss Lighthouse was a piece of Oregon coastal heritage dating to 1887. It had been decommissioned in 1974 when the Coast Guard installed the automated buoy system that now handled navigation for this stretch of rocky coastline. Her grandmother had owned it until her death 3 years ago, at which point it passed to Carolina's mother, who had quietly allowed it to continue deteriorating until a letter from the Clatsop County Heritage Preservation Office had arrived last spring with the words, mandatory restoration or forfeiture, in the subject line. Her mother, who lived in Phoenix now, who had rebuilt her life around sun and golf and a determined forward motion that Carolina deeply respected and sometimes found terrifying, had called Carolina the same evening the letter arrived. I can't go back there, her mother had said, with no preamble, no softening. Just the fact of it, clean and final. I know, Carolina had said. The board wants a licensed restoration architect of record. Your name is apparently in their files from that article in Architectural Digest. Mom, you are the only Voss who is both qualified and geographically mobile. Carolina had been sitting at her desk in her Back Bay apartment, surrounded by 3 active projects and the very specific organized chaos of a woman who had built her professional life as a fortress against any form of unstructured time. She had looked around at the drawings and the scale models and the stacks of reference texts and thought, this is my life. This is the life I made. On purpose. I'll think about it, she'd said. She had thought about it for 6 weeks. She had called her therapist twice about it, which was double her normal monthly session count. She had told her closest friend and colleague, Day, about it over drinks. And Day had said, with the particular precision of someone who had known her for 7 years, "You're already going. You just haven't admitted it yet." She had made a list of reasons not to go that filled 2 yellow legal pad pages, and a reasons to go list that contained 4 entries, one of which was professional obligation, and one of which was mom needs this closure, and neither of which was the real reason. The real reason was something she kept in a box in the back of her mind, behind the professional obligations and the family history, and the legitimate architectural challenge of restoring a 137-year-old masonry lighthouse. And she had become very good at not opening that box. She had made an art form of it, really. She was architecturally gifted and emotionally efficient, and she had not opened that box in 10 years, 4 months, and approximately 11 days. She picked up her portfolio case, squared her shoulders, and walked toward the lighthouse. The keeper's cottage was locked with a padlock that the Heritage Board had sent her a key for. The key arriving by FedEx in a small manila envelope with a photocopied letter, explaining that the electricity had been restored to the cottage, and the water heater was functional, but that she should be advised of some ongoing issues with the bathroom fixtures on the upper level. She had filed this information under Problems for Future Carolina, and focused on getting here first. The interior of the cottage was dim, and smelled of old wood and something faintly mineral, the ocean, pressing through the walls, which had likely been slowly losing their weather sealing for years. The furniture was covered in white sheets that had yellowed to cream. The wide plank pine floors were intact but thirsty, the wood dried and contracting in ways that would need addressing before winter set in properly. The kitchen had been someone's attempt at updating, probably in the 1990s. Laminate counters, a refrigerator that hummed with the persistence of a thing that had been running continuously for 3 decades and had simply forgotten how to stop. Carolina moved through the room slowly, not as a person moving through her family's history, though it was that, but as an architect assessing a space. It was a habit so deeply ingrained now that she sometimes had to consciously remind herself to just be somewhere, to stop reading the bones of a room and simply inhabit it. Her therapist called this defensive professionalism. Carolina called it having standards. The parlor retained its original millwork, the window casings and baseboards exhibiting a quality of hand-carved craftsmanship that would have cost more than the entire renovation budget if replicated today. The brick fireplace was intact, the iron insert original to the period. On the mantelpiece, someone had left a framed photograph. Not a heritage photo, not something old, but a color print from what looked like the early 2000s, slightly sun-faded at the edges. It showed the lighthouse from the water, shot from a kayak or perhaps a low point on the rocks, at a moment when the late afternoon light had come slanting through the fog at precisely the right angle to make the white tower look like something not quite of this world, like something that existed in the liminal space between what was real and what you wished were real. It was an extraordinary photograph. The composition was effortless in the way that very deliberate things appear effortless, the kind of image that looks casual because someone has spent years learning exactly how to hold very still. Carolina held the frame in both hands for a moment, studying it. Then she set it back on the mantel, face down, which was perhaps childish, but which she did anyway, and went to find the circuit breaker. She spent the first afternoon doing what she did best, making order from chaos. She unpacked her equipment with military efficiency. The laser measuring tool, the moisture meters, the structural assessment forms from the Oregon SHPO office, the climbing harness for accessing the exterior walls, the thermal imaging camera borrowed from a colleague in Portland who owed her several favors. She made coffee in the cottage's ancient percolator, which worked perfectly because simple things made of good materials lasted, a fact that Carolina found deeply comforting in an era of planned obsolescence. Then she walked the exterior of the lighthouse tower in a slow, methodical counterclockwise circuit, taking photographs and notes with the focused attention of someone who is very deliberately thinking about load-bearing capacity, and moisture intrusion, and the tensile strength of 19th century iron hardware, and absolutely not thinking about anything else. The tower was structurally sounder than the exterior suggested. This was often the case with granite construction from this period, built by people who expected their work to outlast them by centuries, and who had the professional dignity to ensure it would. The foundation showed no significant settling. The tower walls, 18 inches thick at the base tapering to 12 at the top, exhibited the kind of resilience that modern engineers studied in textbooks. What was failing was everything that had been added later, or that required ongoing maintenance. The lantern room glazing, the external ironwork, the clockwork mechanism in the fog signal building, the electrical systems added in various stages throughout the 20th century. She was photographing a section of deteriorated mortar on the tower's northeast face when she heard it. The sound was distinctive, not intrusive, but precise. A single, clean mechanical click, followed by a pause, followed by another, repetitive and rhythmic in the way of something being operated by someone who had used it so many times that the motion had become entirely automatic, like breathing. A camera shutter. Carolina went still. The sound was coming from above and to her right, from the direction of the cliff edge, where the headland dropped 40 feet to the rocks and the churning gray-green water below. She turned slowly, not wanting to startle, because she had grown up on this coast, and she had a functional respect for the geography of cliff edges and the consequences of being startled near them. The woman was sitting, not standing, not crouching, but actually sitting cross-legged on the very edge of the headland, her boots dangling over nothing, as if the concept of falling were a social convention she had simply opted out of. She had a camera, a Nikon from the shape of it, a serious piece of equipment, raised to her face, aimed not at the lighthouse but at the water below, where a formation of pelicans was conducting what appeared to be a very organized fishing expedition. Her jacket was a faded olive green, the kind that had been washed too many times to remember what color it started as. Her dark hair was pulled back imperfectly, several strands having escaped to whip across her face in the coastal wind, a fact she appeared entirely unconcerned about. Click, pause, click. Carolina knew, before the woman lowered the camera. She knew from the posture, that particular mix of absolute stillness in the torso and loose, unself-conscious ease in the shoulders, as if the body had made a private agreement with gravity. She knew from the way she was sitting on the edge of the cliff like it was an armchair, like danger was something that happened to people who were paying less attention to the light. She knew, and the box in the back of her mind trembled on its shelf. Beth Quinn lowered her camera and tilted her head, and looked directly at Carolina with the same brown eyes that had been looking at Carolina with various degrees of challenge and warmth and unreadable complexity since the 7th grade. "Voss," she said. Not a question, not a greeting exactly, just the name, delivered with the precision of someone identifying a species of bird they'd spotted in an unexpected location. "Quinn," Carolina said back, in precisely the same register, because 23 years of knowing someone creates reflexes you cannot entirely choose. Beth Quinn smiled, not the polite smile of a casual acquaintance, but the specific, slightly asymmetric smile of someone who is genuinely amused, and not particularly trying to hide it, and swung her legs back from the cliff edge with the casual ease of someone stepping off a curb, and stood up in one fluid motion, and walked toward Carolina across the headland grass. "I heard you were coming back," Beth said. "From who?" "This is Cannon Cove, Carolina. Everyone heard." Carolina resisted the urge to say something deflecting and professional, which was her default when she was unsettled. She said instead, "How long have you been sitting on that cliff?" "Since about 7 this morning." Beth glanced at her watch, an old analog thing with a scratched face on a worn leather strap. "It's 2:30. The pelicans were worth it, though. You want to see?" She held the camera out with the easy generosity of someone for whom sharing their work was entirely natural, and Carolina, who had not planned to extend her hand and look at Beth Quinn's photographs within 40 seconds of their reunion, after a decade of deliberate absence, found that her hand had made this decision independently and was already reaching for the camera. The display showed a series of images, the pelicans in various stages of their hunting dive, the water below catching the thin afternoon light, the rocks emerging from the spray. They were exceptional photographs. Not exceptional in the way of technical precision, though the technical precision was evident. Exceptional in the way of seeing, in the sense that the best photographs are not records of what was there, but of what the photographer understood about what was there. The pelicans were not birds. They were embodied intention, the whole improbable evolution of flight condensed into a single instant of total commitment before the water closed over them. "These are remarkable," Carolina said, and heard slightly to her dismay that she meant it without qualification. "Thank you," Beth said simply. She took the camera back and looked at the screen herself for a moment, with the critical eye of someone reviewing their own work with no sentimentality. "The afternoon light's been strange this week. Something coming in from the Pacific. The meteorology people keep sending alerts. Should be interesting." "Interesting," Carolina repeated carefully. "Photographically. Big weather is interesting photographically." Beth glanced at the lighthouse behind them. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough." "The mortar?" "The mortar, the ironwork, the glazing in the lantern room. The fog signal building has essentially been open to the elements on the north side for what looks like at least 3 seasons." Beth winced with the expression of someone who has a personal investment in a structure's well-being. "I was worried about the mechanism." "You know the mechanism?" "I've photographed every inch of this lighthouse for the past 10 years, Carolina. I know the mechanism the way you know load calculations." She paused. "I have photographs, detailed ones, the lantern room, the interior ironwork, the clockwork, dating back to when things were still mostly intact. A beat. In case that's useful to you professionally." The offer landed with a precision that felt, knowing Beth Quinn, entirely deliberate. Carolina looked at her, the wind pulling at her hair, the camera strap worn smooth with use across her shoulder, the way she held herself with the unhurried self-possession of someone who had made a private peace with the life she was living, and stopped waiting for permission to inhabit it fully. Carolina had spent 10 years building a life that was excellent by any measurable standard, and had never quite managed to feel that particular peace. "It might be very useful," she said. "Thank you. Come by tomorrow if you want to look through them." Beth reached into her jacket pocket and produced a business card, an actual physical business card, which was either charmingly retro or profoundly practical depending on your perspective, and held it out. "I'm in the old Hendrickson house, the blue one on Crest Lane. I'm usually there by mid-afternoon when the light gets flat." Carolina took the card. Beth Quinn Photography, Portraiture, Architecture. Coastal Documentation. A phone number, an email, and in the lower right corner, very small, a repeat of that same lighthouse photograph from the cottage mantelpiece, the one she had turned face down. She looked up from the card. Beth was already walking back toward the cliff edge, camera raised again, tracking something in the sky. "Quinn," Carolina called. Beth paused, half-turned. "You're going to sit back on the edge of that cliff." "Yes." "Could you?" Carolina began, and then stopped, because, "Please be careful," was not the kind of thing you said to someone you had last spoken to at your high school graduation. And because Beth Quinn had been sitting on the edges of dangerous things her entire life and had never once fallen, and because the sentence didn't end the way she'd meant it to anyway. "I'm always careful," Beth said, with the slight smile again. "I just don't always look like it." She turned back to the cliff. Click. Pause. Click. Carolina stood in the headland grass for a moment longer than she'd intended, holding the business card, watching Beth Quinn photograph the empty air above the Pacific Ocean as if it contained everything worth seeing. Then she tucked the card into her jacket pocket picked up her measuring tools, and went back to work. The cottage was cold that night, in the specific way of old houses that hold heat badly and let the night in through 100 small gaps that haven't been addressed in decades. Carolina built a fire in the parlor fireplace, with wood from the stack outside, dry, well-seasoned, stacked by someone who knew what they were doing, and set up her laptop and her assessment forms on the low table in front of it, intending to work. She worked for an hour, then she stopped working and stared at the fire. Then she picked the photograph off the mantel and set it facing up again, because turning it down had been childish, and because she was a 41-year-old professional adult who had no reason to be unsettled by a photograph of a building. She looked at it for a long time. The lighthouse in late afternoon light, caught from below, from the water or the rocks, at the exact angle that made it look like something luminous and slightly improbable. The kind of photograph that required patience. Real patience. Not the impatient kind that drummed its fingers and checked its phone, but the kind that could sit for hours on the edge of a cliff and wait for exactly the right moment because it knew the moment would come, and it was not afraid of the waiting. Carolina had always been afraid of the waiting. It was perhaps the central fact of her professional success. She was excellent at creating conditions in which things happened instead of waiting for things to happen, at imposing structure and timeline and decisive action on the inherently uncertain process of making something new from something old. This was a valuable quality in an architect. In other areas of life, it sometimes expressed itself as running. She had left for college 3 days after graduation without saying goodbye to half the people she'd meant to say goodbye to. She had told herself this was efficiency. She was terrible at goodbyes. She had a long drive ahead of her. The goodbyes could happen over text, over time, in the slow, casual way of people staying in touch. She had told herself this for a decade with the determined persistence of someone who was not entirely convinced by their own argument, but had decided to keep making it anyway. She had not said goodbye to Beth Quinn. She had not texted. She had not stayed in touch in the slow, casual way of people staying in touch. She had gone to Boston, and then to graduate school in Philadelphia, and then to a job at a firm in Chicago, and then back to Boston, and she had not come home, and she had not called, and the box on the shelf in the back of her mind had stayed closed, because she was very good at keeping things closed, and because opening it would have required looking directly at something she had spent most of her adolescence carefully looking around. Beth Quinn had always been the thing she looked around. From the 7th grade, when Beth had moved to Cannon Cove mid-year and sat down 2 seats ahead of Carolina in science class and turned around to borrow a pencil and looked at Carolina with those direct, unblinking brown eyes and said, "Do you actually understand this stuff? Or are you faking it like everyone else?" And Carolina had said, startled into honesty, "Both, depending on the unit." And Beth had laughed, real laughter, surprised out of her. And that had been the beginning of everything that was also the beginning of a problem that Carolina hadn't had the vocabulary for at 13, and had spent the next several years building increasingly elaborate structures to avoid thinking about clearly. They had been rivals in the way that people with very similar ambitions and overlapping social territory sometimes are, competing for spots in honors courses, competing in the school's cross-country meets, competing for positions in the small, fierce ecosystem of a high school in a small coastal town, where everyone knew everyone and the smallest distinctions of achievement mattered enormously. The competition had been real. Carolina had genuinely wanted to beat Beth at things, and had sometimes managed it. And Beth had wanted to beat her back, and had sometimes managed that. And the wanting had a charge to it that Carolina had filed under competitive drive, because competitive drive was a category she understood and had words for. She understood, much later, that you can feel 2 things at once and call them only one of them, if the one you call it is safer. She had figured this out about herself, in broad terms, at 24, in the way that people who are very good at understanding external structures sometimes come to understand themselves later than average and all at once, like a building where you've been renovating the interior for years, and one day you go outside and realize the whole facade has changed. She had figured it out, and she had thought about Beth Quinn, and she had not called. because calling felt like opening the box, and she didn't know what was in the box, and she was, fundamentally, afraid. 10 years, 4 months, and approximately 11 days. Carolina turned the photograph face down on the mantel. Then she turned it face up again. Then she went to bed, which was cold, and smelled of cedar from the chest it had probably been stored in, and lay in the dark, and listened to the ocean, and didn't sleep for a very long time. She was on the exterior ironwork at 7:30 the next morning when her phone buzzed with a text from a number she didn't have saved. Cloud's doing something strange this morning. Good strange. If you're near the tower around 8, the light's going to be worth seeing. Carolina looked at the message for a moment, perched on the external staircase 15 feet up, her harness clipped to the handrail, and her moisture meter in her left hand. Then she typed back, "I'm already on the tower," and got a response 11 seconds later that was just a photograph. She had taken it from somewhere on the headland, probably within the last 5 minutes. The lighthouse tower backlit by a sky doing something extraordinary. The cloud cover had broken overnight and reformed in horizontal layers that the early sun was cutting through in distinct beams, each one at a slightly different angle, so the effect was not the usual single shaft of light through clouds, but something more complex, more considered, like a structure made of light by someone who understood the geometry of how illumination works. And at the center of it, small but sharp, the figure of a woman on an iron staircase halfway up a granite tower, the harness clipped to the rail, a tool in her hand, backlit and unaware of being photographed. "That's me," Carolina typed. "Yes," came back, and then a second later. "The light makes everything worth seeing." Carolina stood on the iron staircase in the early morning light and held her phone and felt something she was not going to name right now, and possibly not any time soon. Then she put her phone in her pocket and went back to measuring the tensile failure in the third stair bracket from the top. She went to the blue house on Crestline at 2 o'clock because the Heritage Board assessment forms required photographic documentation of the original structural elements, and because Beth Quinn had 10 years of documentation that would be professionally invaluable, and for no other reason. The house was a Victorian-era craftsman, smaller than its neighbors, wedged between a slightly larger house and a grove of Sitka spruce that had been slowly encroaching on the garden for probably 50 years. The blue had faded to something between slate and periwinkle, a color that looked accidental, but was, she suspected, very deliberate. Window boxes with late-season herbs, a doormat that said, entirely without irony, "Come back with a warrant." She knocked. She heard movement inside, quick, purposeful. And then the door opened and Beth was standing there in a different jacket, charcoal, similarly worn. Her hair down now, a smear of what appeared to be darkroom chemistry on her left forearm, and holding a mug in each hand. "I made 2, she said, offering one. "I saw you pull up." "You were watching?" "The window faces the street. I was editing." She stepped back to let Carolina in. "I'm not watching. I notice things. It's a professional orientation." "Right," Carolina said, and took the coffee, because it smelled like good coffee, and because she had been cold since 7 a.m. The interior of the house was exactly what she might have expected, and also nothing like what she expected, which was the particular surprise of a space that has been made to serve its inhabitant rather than to perform for them. One entire wall of the main room was a working space, a large table with several monitors, external drives, a color calibration tool, all the infrastructure of a professional photography practice. But the rest of the room had the comfortable disorder of someone who actually lived there rather than staged it. Books stacked on every available surface, not decoratively but in active use, spines cracked and papers tucked between pages. A drafting table in the corner that surprised her. Large, angled, the kind used for serious technical drawing. "You draft?" Carolina asked, nodding toward it. "Cartography, mostly. Maps of the coastal erosion. Tracking changes in the headland over time." Beth moved toward the working table and set down her mug. It's for a long-term documentation project. The county erosion study. 12-year longitudinal. I joined at year 3. I didn't know you did that. There are probably a lot of things you don't know I do. She said it without edge, simply as a fact, and pulled out a chair for Carolina at the table. Sit. I'll pull the lighthouse archives. The archives were organized with a rigor that Carolina recognized as the professional cousin of her own. Not perfectionist tidiness, but deep structural logic, the kind of organization that reflects a mind that has thought carefully about how to retrieve information rather than simply how to store it. Beth navigated them with the ease of someone who could find anything in 4 keystrokes. I've been going out there since I was 25, Beth said, pulling up folders by year. When I first moved back, it was just... I was documenting the coast for the erosion project, and the lighthouse was part of the headland. But then I started photographing the structure itself, the details. She clicked open a folder and turned the monitor toward Carolina. The photographs were extraordinary, not just as photographs, though they were that, technically flawless and compositionally considered, but as documents. Beth had photographed the lighthouse with the systematic thoroughness of an architectural survey, every element catalogued, the original ironwork brackets, the clockwork mechanism of the fog signal, the interior of the lantern room with its Fresnel lens still partially intact, the decorative brickwork of the keeper's cottage chimney, the brass hardware on the interior doors, years of it, in chronological order, the slow, incremental deterioration of a structure that no one was maintaining, documented with the patient attention of someone who understood that the record of a thing's decline is also the record of what it was when it was whole. Carolina leaned forward and studied the screen. This is... Beth. She shook her head. This is exactly what I need. The lantern room ironwork, the original glazing profiles. I can't get this from the county archives. They have drawings, but the drawings don't show the actual construction details. These photographs show how it was actually built. I know. Beth was watching her with an expression that was careful and warm in equal measure. That's why I mentioned them yesterday. Would you be willing to share them? With the project? I'd need to... Yes, Beth said simply. Of course. Whatever you need. Carolina looked at her. Why? Beth picked up her coffee, turned her chair slightly so she was facing the monitor rather than Carolina directly, and said, Because that lighthouse has been in your family since 1887. Because it matters. Because I've spent 10 years watching it get lonelier and I'd like very much to watch it get better. A pause. And because I have approximately 6,000 photographs of it and someone should find them useful. The last part landed with a lightness that Carolina recognized as deliberate deflection, the kind she herself employed. Humor as architectural feature, carrying weight while looking decorative. 6,000, she said, give or take. Beth turned back toward her, and there was something in the turn, something in the way she held the moment for just a fraction of a second longer than the conversation required, that registered in Carolina's chest at a frequency just below language. I had a lot of years, and nothing better to do with the afternoons. You could have done anything with the afternoons. I know. Beth held her gaze for exactly the right amount of time to be entirely ambiguous. I chose this. They worked for 3 hours at Beth's table, going through the archive systematically, Carolina identifying the images with the highest structural documentation value, Beth transferring them to a shared folder, both of them occasionally getting drawn into conversations about specific elements of the construction. Beth knew things about the lighthouse that weren't in the Heritage Board's files. She knew that the original clockwork weight system had been partially replaced in the 1930s, that the specific formula of the mortar used in the 1890 renovation could be determined from the color and texture visible in certain photographs, that the external staircase had originally been copper rather than iron, and the iron was a 1920s replacement that was now itself failing. Carolina listened and took notes, and occasionally looked up to find that Beth was watching her write. and looked away again with the same unhurried ease with which she did everything else. "You're still left-handed," Beth said at one point, gesturing at her notepad. "Still," Carolina agreed, carefully not looking up from her notes. "You used to hold the pen like you were angry at it. I was 13. I was angry at most things. You held everything like you were angry at it. There was affection in it, deep and old. Your backpack, your lunch tray, your cross-country baton. I did not. You absolutely did. Coach Adler used to tell you to relax your grip in the handoffs because she was worried you'd crush the baton." A pause. "You never did crush it, though." "No," Carolina said, and looked up. "I learned when to hold on and when to let go." It came out with more weight than she'd intended. The words sat in the air between them for a moment, doing something she hadn't authorized them to do. Beth looked at her. Just looked, with those straight-on, unblinking eyes. And then she smiled, slowly, and said, "Good skill," and turned back to the monitor. Carolina looked at her notepad. She had written the word mortar and underlined it 3 times for no structural reason. By the time she left the blue house on Crestline, it was after 5, and the light had gone to that particular pewter gray of the Oregon coast in late afternoon, the sky and the water becoming indistinguishable at the horizon. She sat in the rental car for a moment before starting it, looking out at the scrubby Sitka spruce at the edge of Beth's property, where a pair of ravens were conducting what appeared to be a dispute of genuine complexity. She had a shared folder with 847 photographs in it. She had 4 pages of notes. She had a clearer sense of the lighthouse's structural history than she'd had this morning. She also had the particular sensation that visits you when you've been inside a warm space for several hours and then step outside, and your body remembers the cold is real. This, too, she filed under professional information and drove back to the keeper's cottage. The meteorological alert arrived on her phone at 9 that evening, while she was working through the structural assessment forms with her coffee, and the parlor fire, and the photograph on the mantel now facing the right direction. The alert was from the National Weather Service, Portland, and it used language she had not seen in a weather alert before. Explosive cyclogenesis event. Atmospheric pressure drop of 25 millibars in 24 hours. Hurricane force gusts possible on exposed headlands. All coastal residents should prepare for power outages of 48 to 72 hours duration. Explosive cyclogenesis was a technical term she knew. She had encountered it in building load calculations for coastal projects, the kind of rapid pressure drop that turned a strong storm into something categorically different. A weather bomb, informally. The kind of event that happened on the Oregon coast perhaps twice a decade, and that historic structures were not designed to survive without preparation. She looked at the alert's timeline. The front was expected to arrive in 5 days. She opened her laptop and pulled up the structural assessment she'd been working on, and began going through it with different eyes. The lantern room glazing, in its current state, would not survive sustained 90-mile-per-hour gusts. The fog signal building's remaining roof structure was similarly vulnerable. The clockwork mechanism, if the fog signal building's partial roof failed entirely, would be exposed to direct water intrusion that would constitute irreversible damage to an irreplaceable historic object. She would need help, and she would need it quickly, and she would need someone who knew this specific structure from the inside out. She picked up her phone and found Beth's number in the contacts she'd added that afternoon, and typed, "Did you see the NWS alert?" The response came back in under a minute. "Yes, the mechanism." Then, 30 seconds later, "When do you want to start?" Carolina looked at the fire, at the photograph of the lighthouse in improbable light, at the 4 pages of notes with the word mortar underlined 3 times. She thought about 5 days. About what could be saved and what couldn't. About the kind of thing that required you to work very closely with someone in a small space under pressure for an extended period of time, which was not, structurally speaking, the same thing as having coffee at a work table in the afternoon. Tomorrow morning, she typed back. 7 o'clock. Bring your documentation. I'll bring breakfast, Beth wrote back, and then a pause, and then, I'm glad you came back, Carolina, even if the timing is terrible. Carolina sat with her phone for a long moment. The fire popped and settled. The wind outside was building, not the storm, not yet, just the coastal night wind finding its register. The ravens had stopped arguing, or had moved their argument elsewhere. She typed, "Me too," then deleted it, then typed it again, then put her phone face down on the table and stared at the ceiling for a while, in the way of a person who has made an admission to themselves that they were not quite ready to make out loud. She was glad she'd come back. She was afraid of what that meant. Both of these things were true, and she was a person who believed in the structural integrity of the truth, even when the truth was load-bearing in ways you hadn't planned for. She picked up the phone and sent the message. She slept better than she had in months. This surprised her. She woke before 6 to the sound of the ocean and the specific quality of light through old glass that meant the sky was doing something interesting, and she lay still for a moment in the cold cedar-scented dark and listened to the sound of a place that had known her before she knew herself. The lighthouse stood on the headland 60 yards from the cottage, patient and improbable, and full of things that needed to be fixed. And she could feel it out there the way you feel the presence of something large and known. Not with alarm, but with a kind of gravity, the weight of a thing that had been waiting, in the particular way of things that do not need to hurry, because they have no doubt that you will come back to them. She got up and made coffee, and stood at the kitchen window looking at the October sky, doing something extraordinary with its light, and thought about patience. Then the knock came at the door at 6:58, and she heard it before she reached the door. The sound of 2 voices, which was wrong. She was expecting one. And she opened the door to find Beth Quinn on her front step in the olive jacket with a bag that smelled of coffee and something warm and baked, and standing slightly behind her with the expression of a woman who has been recruited before she was fully awake. Marisol Ayres, who had been the owner of the Cannon Cove bakery for 15 years and had known Carolina since before the bakery existed, when she was just a girl from town who made extraordinary things in her mother's kitchen. "Marisol," Carolina said. "Caro," Marisol said, and crossed the threshold and hugged her without preamble. The way you hug someone when both of you know perfectly well that 10 years is too long and neither of you is going to make a speech about it. "Beth called me at 5:30 this morning. I told her she owed me a very sincere apology." "I brought cinnamon rolls," Beth said, holding up the bag, "as a sincere apology." "It's a start," Marisol said, and released Carolina and looked at her with sharp, warm eyes that had always seen things that Carolina preferred not to have seen. "You look tired." "I look fine." "You look tired in the way of someone who has been not sleeping productively, which is the worst kind." She turned to examine the cottage interior with the assessing gaze of a woman who was also a small business owner, with no patience for things that were not functioning at their best. "What do you need us to do?" Carolina looked at Marisol, who had known her for 35 years. Then she looked at Beth, who was holding the cinnamon rolls with both hands and watching her with that particular quality of attention that was not intrusive but was very still, the way you hold a camera when the moment is happening. "I need to save a lighthouse," Carolina said. "Then let's save a lighthouse," Beth said. And she smiled, and the morning light came through the old kitchen windows and landed on her face the way extraordinary light lands when someone who knows how to see has been waiting for exactly this. And Carolina thought, I am in very significant trouble. But she held the door open anyway, and they came in, and the work began.